Hello, everyone. So, getting back to our series on fairies and the ballad material, this time I want to tackle what is my personal favorite, and that is the Ballad of the Elfin Knight. And I like this one for a lot of reasons. It has some really interesting material in it, in my opinion. It's not as popular, I don't think, as the ones we've already covered, Thomas the Rhymer and Tamlin, but I do think it's an important one, and it's one that people should be more aware of. So, fun fact, this song is actually the predecessor to the modern song Scarborough Fair. So if you've heard any version of Scarborough Fair, and there's like a million out there, you may actually be familiar with at least the concept behind this ballad. This was the original version. And then over time, the more supernatural elements were sort of slowly removed from the song, so that what initially begins with an elf knight and a human woman or girl, we'll get into that later, slowly morphs into a ballad or a song about a woman who doesn't want to marry an older man, and then that in turn turns into the more familiar today version of Scarborough Fair, which is one lover asking someone to remind their old lover of them with this interesting, it's really more of an impossible quest kind of song, riddle song. So in the context of Scarborough Fair, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. However, when you know what the older version is, what the original version is, I think a lot of the things that are going on in Scarborough Fair do make more sense. You kind of can't remove that supernatural aspect without losing that important context. So basically, the Ballad of the Elfin Knight tells a story of a young woman or a girl. In some versions of the ballad, she's as young as 8. Sometimes she's said to be like 10 or 12. So a young girl, effectively, who hears an elf knight blowing his horn on Belchina morning, May Day morning, and sort of wishes for him to be her own in some sense. And he then appears. It's not really keen on her plan. He's not a fan of this idea, for what I hope would be kind of obvious reasons at this point. And so he tells her that he will marry her, which is what she wants, if she can perform these particular impossible tasks, basically making him a sweater that's not cut or sewn, hasn't been touched by iron effectively. And she then in turn responds with this whole long series of impossible tasks that he needs to complete in order for her to marry him. So it's sort of a, I will make you your magically made sweater if you will then, sow me this field of wheat in the sea sand, basically, and harvest it with a leather scythe and all these other things. And then, of course, it basically comes out that he just does not want to marry her. He is already married. He has 7 children. He is not interested in marrying an 8 or 10-year-old child. And then she, upon hearing that, kind of releases him from this obligation, and the two part ways. Now, as with all the ballads, there are multiple versions of this. The one that I'm going to read for you here is the oldest one that I've been able to personally find. It dates to 1670. I will mention before I start reading it that it does have a repeating line in here. I'm not going to repeat the refrain, but I will mention it. It also talks about a plaid. And when we think of that today, of course, we think of a pattern in a fabric. Plaid, however, in Scots and in the older usage, was actually a reference to a particular type of cloth. The length of cloth it was worn. You can wrap it around you. If you can kind of picture like a kilt and then wrapped up over around the shoulder as well. It was also used, however, as a blanket. So you would wear it as clothing, but you would also use it like as a blanket to sleep under. There are some sexual implications with that idea, laying under someone's plaid, and it was also sometimes used as a reference for like covering your family, protecting your family, that sort of thing. So layers of concept going on here. I just want to mention that before I start reading, because I have a feeling that'll confuse people. So this is the Elfin Knight version 2B, dating again to 1670. My plaid away, and over the hills and far away to Norway. My plaid shall not be blown away. The Elfin Knight stands on yonder hill. And the refrain is, ba, 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 lily ba. He blows his horn both loud and shrill. There's an alternate version of the refrain, which would be ba, 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 lily ba. The wind has blown my plaid away. Getting back into the main text. He blows it east, he blows it west, he blows it where he likes it best. I wish that horn were in my chest, yes, and the night in my arms next. She had no sooner these words said than the knight came to her bed. You are too young a girl, he said, married with me that you would be. I have a sister younger than I, and she was married yesterday. Married with me if you would be, a courtesy you must do for me. It's you must make a shirt for me without any cut or seam, said he, and you must shape it knife and shearless, and also sew it needle and threadless. If that piece of courtesy I do for you, another you must do for me. I have an acre of good untilled land, which lays low by yonder seashore. It's you must till it with your blowing horn, and you must sow it with peppercorn, and you must harrow with a thorn, and have your work done before the morning. And you must shear it with your knife, and not lose a stack of it for your life. And you must stack it in a mouse hole, and you must thresh it in your shoe sole, and you must prepare it in the palm of your hand, and also stack it in your glove, and you must bring it over the sea, fair and dry and clean to me. And when you've done and finished your work, you'll come to me and you'll get your shirt. I'll not abandon my plaid for my life. It covers my 7 children and my wife. My maidenhead I'll then keep still. Let the Elfin Knight do what he will. So again, this is the oldest version I've been able to find. That was in Child's Ballads book from 1898, but the version itself dates again to the 17th century. So you can kind of see the parts of that make it into Scarborough Fair. And again, the riddle aspect of it doesn't make as much sense when the supernatural parts have been removed. In this context, however, what we see is there seems to be some sort of power in hearing this Elfin Knight blowing his horn on May Day. May Day, of course, or Belchina, is a holiday pretty much throughout Western Europe, as far as I'm aware, that has very strong associations with the good folk and the idea that they are much more active and present in the human world. So it is significant that this event is happening on that day. I don't think it was mentioned in this particular version, but in other versions it's specified to be that day. And the fact that this girl hears him blowing his horn and then makes a wish, wishes for him to be her husband, effectively. She's not quite that wording. She literally wishes for him in her bed. But either way, he seems to be sort of compelled to respond to that. It seems as if when she makes that wish, whether it's because of the timing of it, whether it's because she was able to hear the horn, is unclear, but for whatever reason, he is compelled to respond. He has to go to her. He pretty much immediately makes it clear that he does not want to marry her. In this version, as I said, he kind of specifies that she's too young. It doesn't say how old she is in this version. In other versions, ages are given. In this one, he says she's too young. She says she has a sister who got married the day before. In other versions, it does kind of specify that she is potentially as young as 8. in some cases slightly older. Sorry, 9. I'm just double checking my notes to make sure I'm giving this correct. So 9 years old is the youngest age that she's referenced as in any of the versions. In the others, it's kind of implied that she's marriageable age, but he clearly considers that she's too young. And he pretty much says, married with me you'll never be. Effectively, like, I do not want to marry you. However, again, because of apparently whatever magic has compelled him to go to her to respond to this wish, it seems like he can't just leave. Even when he's saying, like, this is a bad idea. You and I are a bad match. You are too young. And in other versions, she responds to that initially more with a, in this one, it was my sister is already married. In others, it's more of a, no, I'm perfectly old enough to do what I want to do with this kind of thing. But he clearly does not want to do it, but he also clearly cannot just leave. So what he does in the version, which is particularly interesting from my perspective, is responds by telling her that he will do what she wants, which apparently he has to do. But in order for him to do that, she needs to do something for him first. He refers to it as a courtesy. And that is producing this magical shirt, basically. It's sew me a shirt with no needle or thread, with no scissors, no knife. Like, it can't be touched by iron, is the gist of what he's saying in any way, and also made without thread. So that's an interesting riddle. Think of how one would make such a garment. But clearly this is not something this girl is going to be able to do, or do easily, or do quickly. And it buys him some time, effectively. And she then responds in turn with a sort of, I will make you this magical shirt, but you need to do this for me. And then, of course, her response is much longer than his initial request, and much more complicated. And we might kind of wonder why that is, but in perspective, of course, he is asking this human girl, potentially 9 years old, maybe a little bit older, to do this very magical thing, which she is not going to be able to do. She, however, is asking this magical being, this Elfin Knight, to do something. And it should be understood that it would be assumed that he had a much greater ability to do impossible things. So instead of just asking him to do something fairly simple and straightforward, it's this whole process. We can also, of course, read a little bit into this with the nature of each of their tasks. He gives the girl what would be considered a very domestic, very archetypally feminine kind of task with this making the shirt. She in turn gives him what would be, again, considered a sort of archetypically masculine or male-coded task, particularly for that culture at that time in farming. If I could speak English, that would help. In farming, and planting this crop and harvesting it, and then bringing the produce. Both of them have to bring the produce, the result of what they create, to the other one, in order to get this, what they want. He, of course, then hearing this is a little more blunt, and, we can sort of contemplate whether her responding by asking him this request has given him a little more leeway or freed him up a little bit, so that he can be a little more blunt with her. And he just, effectively says, I do not want to be your lover or your husband. I already have a previous commitment. I already have a wife, not looking for another one. And when she hears that, she then responds by freeing him of the situation entirely. In this case, she tells him that she will keep her maidenhead, she'll keep her virginity, and that he can go do whatever he wants to do. And the implication, of course, at that point is that he then leaves because he does not want to do any of this and didn't want to do any of that from the very beginning. There are some alternate versions, of course. Some of them make her task more difficult. So it's not just making this impossible, not touched by iron, threadless shirt. He also, in some versions, asks her to then go wash it in a well that was not filled by rainwater or standing water, or to hang it on a thorn that hasn't flowered or bloomed, things like that. Um, so I'm trying to think of, this is the alternate version D. Wash it in yonder well, where the dew never wet nor the rain never fell, and you must dry it on a thorn that never budded since Adam was born. And then alternate version C, you must wash it in yonder cistern, where water never stood nor ran, and you must dry it on yonder hawthorn, where the sun never shone since man was born. So in both of those, it's adding a layer of impossibility to her tasks, to find this source of water that basically is impossible. It can't exist. The second one's a little more clear with that water that never stood nor ran. Obviously, it has to do one or the other. And the mention of the hawthorn is particularly interesting because, of course, that is a fairy tree. So the idea of having to hang it on a fairy tree that the sun has never shone on, there's a little bit of an implication there that he might be referencing a fairy tree actually in the land of fairy, because there are a lot of mentions in different fairy lore to those trees. I shouldn't say to those trees, to fairy itself neither having sun nor moon, which is something we touched on in Thomas the Rhymer. So, he's kind of giving her something that no matter how clever she is, she's not going to be able to do. It's much more explicit with the well and the thorn added in. Just making the shirt, I'm sure if you're clever enough and you really think about it, there is a way to answer that particular riddle. But adding in the water and the thorn makes it more clearly impossible. And then, of course, she responds with her whole list of things. It is interesting to note that most likely, given that he is an Elfin Knight, he probably could do everything that she's asking him to do if he wanted to. She is sort of being fairly creative in what she's asking him to plant, literally, between the wave and the sand on the shore, harvest with things that aren't used for harvesting, collect it in these, very minuscule types of items, carry across the sea without getting wet, things like that. But the sort of implication is, because of what he is, because of his nature, he probably could do those things, whereas the task he's giving her is much more blatantly impossible. And then, of course, we get into where he just makes it very clear, he's very blunt, that he already has 7 children and a wife, and he's not looking for any more of that. It's particularly interesting to me that he doesn't seem able to leave until she gives him permission to go. Because even when he says, I don't want to marry you, I have a wife, not interested in this, he still stays. It isn't really until she says, then I don't want to do this anymore, I don't care what you do, that he seems to be able to leave. So again, it kind of reinforces this idea that there is some sort of compulsion aspect going on, that he has been compelled to respond and to answer her, and that once he is there, he doesn't have the power to leave necessarily, that he is sort of obligated to either give her what she wants, or at least to stay and try to engage in this sort of complicated bargaining. So, as I said, we then see after this ballad, it was then taken and modified multiple times until we get the Scarborough Fair of today. You can find some good versions of the Elfin Knight online, on YouTube actually. And I do recommend listening to it if you're able to. Obviously, me reading it, you get the gist, you get the concept of what's being said, but it is much better to listen to it performed and to kind of get that full level of it, I would say. It's also worth noting, as I mentioned, that the mention of the plaid, which shows up at the beginning, and then when he's like, my plaid's already spoken for, basically. It does have sexual connotations as well as that sort of implied covering or protection of the family. Many of the herbs that get mentioned in the later versions, Scarborough Fair, for those of you who are familiar, um, rosemary, thyme, sage, and rue, I think are the ones in there. I'm not doing those in the correct order, but I believe that's most of them. And in some of the other middle versions, they mention rose is another one. Many of those do have connections to love magic. So there definitely seem to be that strong sort of overtone to the entire piece. I find this one particularly fascinating because in a lot of the material that we have, elves and elfin knights appear in a very sort of overtly sexual, overtly seductive role. And here we have an example, again dating to 1670, where the exact opposite is kind of what is going on. The human girl is the one more or less trying to seduce him. And he's the one who is like not interested. So, and that is a real reversal from what we find in a lot of the other material. The next ballad we're going to discuss is Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, and you'll kind of see how that is a very different story, even though it has some similar themes going on, particularly a very similar beginning. So, some things to contemplate with the Elfin Knight are this idea of the importance of May 1st, the importance of that particular time, this idea of hearing this elfin horn and then making this wish, and that having the power to compel this otherwise very powerful being. And then, of course, we can give some thought to the different symbolism and what they're each asked to do. Always worth thinking about that, and that's got a lot of layers to it. And then, of course, as I've mentioned several times at this point, but I can't emphasize it enough, sort of the aspects of consent that we see coming up here. We touched on in Tam Lin the idea that human women who went to Tam Lin's well were sort of compelled or required to pay a toll, which could include their maidenhead. They would have to have sex with him. And here we sort of see an inversion of that, where we have this girl, potentially very young, potentially slightly less young, but either way, young, who really wants to kind of do what Janet did in Tam Lin and have this elven lover. And the elf is the one who is saying, "You are too young for me. I am not interested in this. Also, already have a wife." Like, there's a whole laundry list of reasons why he does not want to do this. But it's that literal flipping the script. And instead of him being forcibly compelled to do it, he sort of talks his way out of it, is kind of what we see going on. But the implications with all of that and the implications around consent with all of that, I think are very, very interesting, and particularly in relation to fairy lore, and in relation to the wider stories about these beings, which would have been contemporary to this ballad, as these sort of very overtly sexual beings that would seduce people and were considered often very amoral. And in this ballad, we sort of see a very different picture being created. So lots of food for thought here, I think. And I do encourage people to give all of this some contemplation. I also will say I am a huge advocate for the importance of consent, even with non-corporeal or spirit beings or fairies or what have you. Consent for everyone. Consent is important. So I think this is a particularly interesting ballad to look at and think about. Also kind of worth looking at the wider magical implications of the summoning of this elf and the way he couldn't leave until she released him. She told him he could go, which, potentially could kind of tie into some of the fairy grimoire material if that interests you. Look into the Book of Oberon if that interests you, by the way, because that kind of touches on some of that. But lots going on here. Lots of layers, lots of implications, lots of food for thought. I will leave you all with that for now. And next time we will jump into Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, which is both a very similar ballad and a very, very different ballad. So I think that'll be another interesting thing to discuss. Hope you all have a wonderful time, day, month, week, year, whatever you have going on. I hope it's great. And I will see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.